Welcome to Train Freediving. My name is Nathan, and today I'm going to talk to you about how to do CO2 training in a way that's going to delay your contractions and make your urge to breathe come later and later into your freedives. As a freediver, whether you've been diving for just a few days or you're an elite athlete who's been diving for years, you've probably experienced the urge to breathe at some point during your breath holds. With this urge to breathe, you've also probably realized that holding your breath is much more enjoyable, it's much more relaxing before the urge to breathe starts compared to after it starts. So I think it goes without saying that one of the things that we should be trying to achieve with our training is to push our urge to breathe later and later into our dives. I could sit here and tell you that there are magic pills to take that are going to delete your contractions. I could tell you that there's some type of yoga, meditation, or stretching that's going to delete your contractions. I could tell you that you can put the tongue in the top of your mouth and slowly exhale into your nose clip and use this pressure to suppress or delay the contraction. Or I could tell you that all you need to do is push yourself as hard as possible in training, and after years and years and years, eventually your urge to breathe is going to be delayed. Now, all of those things would be lies. You're not solving the problem. You're not limiting or delaying the urge to breathe. You're not improving or increasing the amount of CO2 that you can tolerate before it causes any type of discomfort. Most likely, what I'm about to tell you is going to surprise you. The best way to learn to delay your contractions, the best way to increase your CO2 tolerance is to do lots of training, lots of regular breath holds, CO2 tables, dynamic and static exercises without having contractions. And that's it. Eventually, after doing this in a systematic, structured, and progressively more and more challenging way, you are going to develop a stronger CO2 tolerance. If you look at this graph that I've made, on this side of the graph, we're going to have our CO2. So this is the total amount of CO2 in our body during the breath hold. And on this part of the graph, we're going to have time. I've also included 3 dotted lines. So the black dotted line represents the noticeable amount of CO2. This is the first point during your breath hold where you realize, where you feel that you've actually been holding your breath. So before this, there's no sensations at all. It's not uncomfortable. It's not an urge to breathe. It's just the first signs of slightly increased CO2. The second line, the blue dotted line, is going to be what I call our threshold level of CO2. This is where we experience our first contraction or our first strong urge to breathe. So some people, the strong urge to breathe comes before the contraction, and for other people, the contraction comes before that strong desire to breathe. Either way, this threshold level of CO2 is when one of these things starts. And then finally, at the top of the graph, we have our red dotted line, which is representative of our current maximum level of CO2. This is going to be when you just quit your breath hold, where you give up because you don't want to have urge to breathe anymore, you don't want to have contractions anymore, and you cannot tolerate increasing or holding any more CO2 than you currently have. Methodologically, we can use these 3 points as a way to train our CO2 tolerance. The big mistake that I see a lot of divers doing, the reason why you're having contractions in all of your training sessions, the reason you're not improving your CO2 tolerance is because you're consistently and regularly passing the blue line, exposing yourself to a strong urge to breathe, to a contraction. All of your CO2 tables, all of your breath hold tables, all of your dynamic training is taking you to that point where you're starting to suffer. In my opinion, this doesn't work. The aim of CO2 training is to teach yourself to not react. I'm going to share with you 3 methods to achieve that goal. Increasing your CO2 up to a threshold point reducing your reaction, both physical and mental, to this increased CO2. So the first method is very simple. All you need to do is hold your breath until your first contraction, have a full recovery, and repeat that process again. So method 1, represented by the black line on the graph, you're going to start your breath hold it for a certain amount of time, however long it takes to reach this threshold level of CO2, where you experience your first contraction or your first urge to breathe, and then you simply stop the breath hold and have a full recovery. Your CO2 is going to drop back down to a resting level, and then you can repeat this process. Generally, I recommend doing between 5 and 8 breath holds at this point of your training. Now, the second method, which is a little bit more advanced, is to have a slight and steady average increase in CO2 over the course of your training table. It would look something like this. So represented by the red line on the graph, during this type of training, you're going to increase your CO2 level up to the noticeable level, that first baseline of CO2, have a short recovery, and then perform another breath hold of equal length, and over the course of your table, you're going to get higher and higher up to your threshold level. Again, with this type of training, the table should stop, so either you stop your breath holds or you select a recovery time between breath holds that allows you to only get up to your threshold level of CO2. If on any breath hold you get up to the point where you are beyond threshold and you're having contractions, you've gone too far, you're using a time that's too long, or your recovery is too short. Finally, the most advanced form of CO2 training is to increase your CO2 up to the threshold level, and then balancing with short recoveries and shorter breath holds to try and maintain it between your noticeable CO2 level and your threshold CO2 level. So this would look something like this. So again, as you see with the blue line on the graph, the first breath hold brings you up to just before your first contraction, and then you perform a short recovery, just enough to drop your CO2 so that you could perform another breath hold back up to just before your first contraction. You would then repeat this process for a few more holds, making sure to stop your table before you have your first contraction. So I'm just going to give some exercise examples for you to use with one of these 3 CO2 training methods. So method 1, the most basic training method, which is just holding your breath until the first contraction. You could do something like 5 times static breath hold until first contraction, or 5 times dynamic breath hold again until first contraction. Method 2, which involves bringing your CO2, your average CO2, higher and higher, closer and closer to your threshold where you have your first contraction, can be done by either doing the classic CO2 table, so the one that we all learn when we start freediving, which is 8 breath holds at a fixed time, starting with a 1 minute 45 second recovery and then decreasing recovery by 15 seconds each breath hold until we finish with a 15-second recovery, or by doing 8 times a fixed distance in dynamic, either 25 meters or 50 meters, depending on your level, and then having a fixed short recovery between each lap. The most important thing is that with the classic CO2 table, you're selecting a breath hold time that you can finish all 8 holds without having any contractions. And with dynamic, you should select a recovery that allows you to do all 8 laps without having contractions. Now, the final method, which involves maintaining your CO2 within the noticeable CO2 level and the threshold level for an extended period of time, is going to involve doing a longer breath hold, followed by a short recovery and then a few shorter breath holds. So with static training, the method that I like to use is a 50% of your personal best static, followed by 2 times 25%. So the total duration of the entire exercise is 1 times your personal best. And between each of the 3 breath holds, you're going to take 1 to 5 breaths. You should select the number of breaths according to what you can do to finish the entire set without any contractions. You can then repeat this set 3 to 5 times with plenty of recovery between each set. The dynamic version of this exercise done in the pool will be to do a 50-meter dynamic followed by 2 to 6 times 25 meters, again only with 1 to 5 recovery breaths between each dynamic breath hold. Just like with the static version, you should select a number of breaths where you can complete the entire set without having any contractions, and with plenty of recovery time between sets, you can repeat this exercise for 3 to 5 sets. With all 3 methods that I've shared with you, the way they work is by adjusting them to the point where you can complete each of the exercises without having any contractions or strong urge to breathe. So if you want to have comfortable, stress-free diving, I suggest stop having contractions during your training and perform these types of exercises to help improve the total amount of CO2 that you can tolerate without having any type of physical or mental reaction to that CO2.